different ways for conceptualizing the structure of a story, but I like this one because it's both simple enough that it can apply to a lot of different types of stories while also kind of clear enough and detailed enough that it actually gives us some direction for thinking about how a story should work and how to build a story. Not all stories are going to fit this model exactly. There are different types of story structures and also the particular individual variations of a story and what happens sometimes mean these need to be tweaked a little bit. But as a basic framework, I think it's pretty good. So this is called Freytag's pyramid because it forms like sort of a pyramid shape, right? Like you're sort of climbing up a hill till you get to the climax and then you come back down again. Basically, you start with exposition, which is setting the scene, giving the reader some background information so that they kind of know, okay, here's the deal, here's the kind of world that we're in, here's what's been going on, here's the relationships between the characters, here's who everybody is. Now, realistically, when you read longer stories, especially, a lot of times exposition doesn't always come right at the beginning. Sometimes it's kind of sprinkled around throughout. But basically, the exposition is like information. It's not stuff happening in the story. Oftentimes, then there's some kind of inciting incident that is going to disrupt the normal of the story world, right? And it's why something happens that's worth telling a story about. But this inciting incident, first of all, sometimes it's not just one thing. There could be a couple different things that happen. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be something that happens per se in a concrete sense. It could also just be something emotional or psychological that shifts for a character in the story. But the main idea is there's something that kicks things off. And then we start to have the development of the conflict, some kind of buildup of tension, right? We have what's called rising action, which means the stuff is happening, right? That's kind of coming off of the inciting incident. Things are starting to change for the characters and their relationships or the way they see the world. Something's coming in to kind of trouble what's normal and expected until we get to the climax, some kind of crisis point, turning point, that is the culmination of everything that came before. So everything is sort of leading to this, but then it also somehow releases that tension, either because everything blows up, or because we find some kind of resolution, right? And then, okay, everything kind of gets neatened up again or sort of figured out. That's the falling action. And then we might get back to a point of denouement, some kind of conclusion for the story, although that doesn't necessarily mean that the tension is resolved. And that's why I like the word denouement instead of conclusion, because conclusion makes it sound like everything's concluded, right? Like we've figured everything out and everything's back to normal. But sometimes the endings of our stories are more ambiguous, right? So denouement is just sort of the period of stasis, like we realize the story's not happening anymore. There's some kind of endpoint and we've come back to a normal of sorts, although it doesn't have to be the same normal where we started. And it doesn't necessarily have to be even good or happy, right? It just means that we recognize that the trajectory of events that was occurring during the story has now reached its end. So this story structure, again, it's useful because it's so flexible, because you can see this happening even in very, 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 very short stories that don't have a lot of detail. A lot of times we'll still follow this structure. So for example, if we think about the stories that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie tells in her talk, right? Very, very short, but they still all kind of follow this basic thing. The first story that she talks about, her writing as a young person, right? And she mentions how, okay, when she started writing, right, this was the deal. This was the situation. She was writing all these books about blonde-haired, blue-eyed children who, drank ginger beer and talked about the weather. So that's just sort of how things are. At the moment, that's our exposition, right? She's giving us the background info. Here's the deal. She was writing these stories. And then the inciting incident in this case maybe is not actually so much happening to her happening to the character. It's more for the reader, right? What sets off the tension in this story is that we realize there's something weird about the information she just gave us. There's something off about the world that she's describing. And that happens when she introduces that twist of, I've been writing all of these stories, but actually that has nothing to do with my experience or anything that I'd ever seen play out in my own life, right? So now that starts to introduce tension of like, oh, that's strange, right? She was writing all these stories, but in fact, here's all of the ways that her life was different from these stories, right? So Adichie starts telling us about how, well, she didn't eat mangoes. She didn't eat apples, she ate mangoes, right? And they never talked about the weather. And no one she knew had blonde hair and blue eyes. So that starts to build the tension, right? All of these ongoing revelations about how her experience was very different from the stories that she had read until we get to the point where she has the realization, her young self, that, hey, I have been kind of fooled by all of the books that I've been reading, which have all been coming from white European authors. They've kind of tripped me into thinking that all stories have to be about white European characters and that people like me, don't have a place in literature and that maybe our stories aren't worth being told or nobody wants to listen to them. And she realizes how she's been influenced and she realizes that it's wrong, right? And that's sort of the climax. And then at that point, she kind of reveals to us that changes the way that she thinks about writing. And so then in the denouement of the story, we learn that now her stories are different, right? Now she started writing stories about people like her. So we've resolved things, right? We've come back to a sort of new normal that's now transformed from the way things were at the beginning of the story. Similar structure we see happening. The second story Adichie tells, she talks about Fide. And in the exposition, we learn a little bit about her family, her background, right? That they were a little well off, especially in comparison to some of the people around them. And then I would say the inciting incident in this case, again, is less about a change in the story, but more about something that's revealed to us that makes a difference in the story, which is the interactions between Fide and Adichie's family and the things that she was told by her mother, right? That, don't you know, Fide's family would, love to have some of the things that you have. And all of the ways in which she is now receiving messages and her mind is being shaped in her attitude about Fide and Fide's family and the type of people they are is shaped. And then we get to, though, the climax when she goes to visit Fide's family and she realizes that everything she's been thinking was wrong, right? Because she sees this beautiful basket that was created by a member of his family, and she realizes how she's been making all of these judgments and assumptions about Fide's family. And so then the after effects of that, right, that moment where she sees the basket, are that she has to kind of revise all of her thoughts and all of her opinions about Fide's family and recognize that just because somebody is poor does not mean that they are crippled or not capable of doing something meaningful or creating something beautiful, right? And so again, the denouement is really more about her transformation in that moment and the way that she now thinks about things differently. And also the recognition that she's had about the nature of single stories, right? And of her own the sort of seductiveness of simplifying things and turning to stereotypes or prejudgments, right? And how we have to be careful of that. That's kind of all tied up in the denouement, this new realization that she has, and the way that has changed how she looks at the world. So, as you're working on your own story, think about this structure, right? Think about, okay, what is the essential information that my reader will need to know? There's your exposition, right? Then what happens, right? Is there something, maybe there isn't necessarily a very clear, specific inciting incident, but think about if there's something that kind of kicks everything off. What is it that is building up the conflict, right? The tension in the story. And then where is it all leading, right? What's kind of the most important moment in the story, your climax, and then make sure that you're organizing things so that the lead up to that is clear and that you're choosing the details that you include in your story because they are helping guide your reader, build everything up towards the climax of the story, right? And then, of course, right, explaining how everything gets resolved. But this is going to be really essential, right, that you're choosing your details very carefully with this sort of structure in mind. How am I building towards my climax in a way that produces tension and makes my reader want to see where things are going, but also once they get there, they can see how they got there. They can realize that everything's been building to this moment, right? You don't want the climax to just completely come out of nowhere, because then that would mean that the whole rest of the story was sort of pointless, right? Like, there has to be a connection, and the climax has to feel, even though it might be unexpected, it has to feel like it is the culmination of everything that came before. So when you're thinking about your structure, make sure that you know what these points are, right? What is your climax? What's building you? And how is the rest of your story building towards that? And then how is the climax resolved? And choose details to include that are doing work for your story. Either you've got to have that information in there because otherwise people won't understand what's happening, or it is helping to develop the central conflict of the story.